Is my screen pretty clear? I've got a little something down
Yeah.
on the bottom, but I hope it doesn't show up on the camera.
It'll go
Good.
away when she
Okay.
admits everybody.
And we are going to do that now. Welcome to the Northern Kentucky History Hour. We'll be letting everyone in for the next minute or so, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Good evening and welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. We'll be letting everyone in for the next minute or so, and then we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Good evening and welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm Tara Johnson-Noem, your host for tonight, and I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. Let's see. First of all, everyone will find their microphone has been muted, and that is just for everyone's convenience so that everyone can hear the presentation. And then if you wish, you certainly are welcome to turn off your video, but certainly not required. And also, we are, let's get started with some of the information about tonight's program. The Northern Kentucky History Hour is a product of Behringer-Crawford Museum. As a trustee of the museum, I'd like to say on behalf of all the trustees and the staff of Behringer-Crawford Museum how pleased we are for this program to be able to continue. There are a number of organizations that support our museum. The City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, the Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. U.S. Bank Foundation, and our members. If you're not already a member of the museum, we would love to have you as a member. And so you can find out more about that at our website, bcmuseum.org. Also, tonight's program is not only happening via Zoom, it's also being live streamed on Facebook. So if there's any part of the presentation that you'd like to watch again, or if one of your friends happens to miss it, they can go to Behringer-Crawford Museum's Facebook page and watch not only this episode, but actually all of the previous Northern Kentucky History Hours. And this, incidentally, is our 13th episode. So many of you, I see your names and you've been with us from the very beginning. And so welcome and thank you for your support. Let's see. Oh, as a reminder, because the microphones are muted, if you have a question, we would love for you to still participate in tonight's conversation. And so you can do that by using the chat feature that Zoom has. So at maybe the bottom of the screen or the top, depending on your version of Zoom, you should see chat. You can open that. I will occasionally leave messages for everyone, like reminders to ask questions and a reminder about the quiz question that we will be having later. And also, you can submit your questions. I will compile all of those and ask our guests at the end. So again, thank you and welcome. Let's get to tonight's speakers. And this is our first episode where we have two presenters. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about both of them. So first, Robert Shroggi. Bob has been a guest on the History Hour before, so welcome back, Bob. Robert Shroggi is very active in local history circles. He's served on the boards of the Rabbit Hash Historical Society, Boone County Preservation Board, and Behringer-Crawford's board. In 2015, Shroggi received the William Conrad Preservation Excellence Award for lifetime achievement in preservation of local history. He is the author of history and several books. A few of his previous works include Lost Northern Kentucky, which we would like to hear about someday, Legendary Locals of Covington, which he spoke about in a previous episode, Eyewitness to History, a personal journal, winner of honorable mentions at the New York, Amsterdam, and Florida book festivals, by the way, Carl Kiger, The Man Beyond the Murder, Ohio River from Cincinnati to Louisville, Boone County then and now, and Burlington. Our second guest is John Schaaf. He's retired as executive director of the Kentucky Legislative Ethics Commission, where he worked for 15 years, and he served on the steering committee of the International Council of Governmental Ethics Laws. Prior to that, he was general counsel for the Legislative Research Commission, as well as an attorney with a Louisville law firm, and he had a brief stint as an editor of a weekly newspaper. Mr. Schaaf received a degree in journalism from the University of Kentucky and his JD from the Louis D. Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. This is his first effort, he says, at writing a book. So welcome to you both, Bob and John. Thank you so much. And why don't you get started?
You want to start with the trivia question?
I think that
John?
sounds like a great idea.
We have a trivia question John's going to do real quick. And
just as a reminder, as John gets started, that the first correct respondent of our quiz question tonight will be the recipient of both bragging rights and a History Hour pin. So, John, go ahead.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks for having us too. The quiz question tonight is, besides Governor Goebel, who was the other Kentucky governor from Northern Kentucky? And here's a hint. He was personal friends with both President James Madison and with future Governor Goebel.
okay.
So,
All right.
There you
Thanks,
go.
John. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. You should see a screen up there, and I'll go through the PowerPoint as we get to the relevant topics. But really wanted to just start out and say how this book came to fruition. The publisher actually had called me. I had done some books with the History Press, and they had this idea, and really liked the idea and agreed to do it. And then I interviewed several people, 3 or 4, and every one of them said that I needed to talk to John Schaaf. And so I blindly called John up on the phone and said, could we meet for lunch? And as I talked to him, I thought, and then on the way home from that lunch in Georgetown, it just dawned on me that this book could not be written without John Schaaf participating in it, because he was such a wealth of knowledge on the topic. And when I was right, I mean, this book is a million times better because he's a part of it. So that's how it came apart. And this, and we wrote it and did everything probably in 6 months or something. So this was only 6-7 months ago that conversation took place. But the history of political scandals in Kentucky is certainly a very interesting thing. When Kentucky first became a state in 1792, there's been a lot of good people who have governed the state, governed local government. However, in business and government, human nature has led to some scandals and a lot of colorful characters, stories, and in several cases, legal reforms that have put, future scandals, has minimized future scandals. And many aspects of Kentucky experiences are really marked by trickery and corruption, and we see a lot of that. John Ed Pierce, and I'll paraphrase him, John Ed Pierce said, a big reason why local courthouses and state government and stuff have had a lot of corruption is because of poverty. Well, that's true, but there are also a lot of reasons why Kentucky has had its fair share of scandal and corruption, and we'll get into that. And the purpose of this book is to really look at some of the more unusual and outrageous episodes of scandals in Kentucky, sort of the darker side of human nature, of greed and dishonesty and fraud. Now, it would be inaccurate, and I think I learned this in doing the book, but it'd be inaccurate to say that scandal has defined Kentucky or the Kentucky scandals are worse than any other state in the nation. And in fact, John will talk about Operation BOPTROT, the most serious scandal perhaps in the history of the state, led to legal reforms in which Kentucky is at the forefront of those reforms. And he'll talk about that a little bit. One of the things we get into some depth about at the beginning of the book, the first real Kentucky scandal probably happened right about the time of statehood. And that was with land surveyors. As land surveyors really came to Kentucky between 1777 and 1779, they came through, from Virginia and Pennsylvania and North Carolina. And, they weren't always the most upstanding citizens. And they would, they would give out land grants, but sometimes land wasn't attached to the property, and then they would wait, and somehow at the end of a year in which people had rights to claim, they would come in and sneak in and snatch up the land grant. So we get into that fairly in depth. The first person I really want to talk about is this person, James Wilkinson. James Wilkinson is probably the first, in fact, is the first really scandalous figure in Kentucky that had national implications. He was born in Maryland, but he eventually made his way to Kentucky. Now, for all rights and purposes, you can conclude that Wilkinson was a hero. I mean, he served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. He was, commissioned a captain in 1775, and he served as an aide to Nathaniel Greene. Now, Wilkinson, was an aide to Benedict Arnold, and soon after to Horatio Gates. And you may recognize some of these, these names. In fact, Gates, after the win at the victory at Saratoga, Gates sent Wilkinson to Congress to talk about and to inform them of the victory. Well, Wilkinson made Congress wait for personal reasons, and then he really exaggerated his role in the Battle of Saratoga. And it was really one of the first deceptions that he did. But what came out of that is Congress bought it all, and as a result, he was given the rank of brevet rank general or brigadier general, and he was just 20 years old. But his sort of long history of deceit had started, and his promotion to that caused a lot of people to look negatively on him, and some people. I mean, he was active in the Conway-Cobble conspiracy, which was to replace George Washington with Horatio Gates as commander-in-chief. And as a result of that, he was forced to resign his post. But he went on to fight, and he was in essence a hero, and based on his Revolutionary War record. However, he was a traitor, and he was a big-time traitor. He also, by the way, advocated. There were two strong sides of Virginia at the time. One is that Kentucky would be a part of Virginia. Another part that was Kentucky would become a separate state. However, Wilkinson advocated a third alternative secretly, and it was a proposal that he led for Kentucky to succeed from the Union and become part of the Spanish Empire. And he traveled to New Orleans to meet with the Louisiana governor, which was, of course, Spanish-controlled territory. And in a feat of amazing treachery and arrogance, he said he could control the shipping lanes down the river from Kentucky to Louisiana, and he could even get Kentucky into the Spanish sphere of influence. And in return, he wanted a trade monopoly, a pension, and a rank in the Spanish military. And he basically said that he can control Kentucky. At home, he would advocate for Kentucky's separation, as I said, from both Virginia and the United States. Well, he got a pension of $7,000 from the Spanish, but he began that was not unknown. So he began a second military career. You know, he was his treacherous role was sort of put on hold, and he eventually made his way all the way up to the #1 person in the United States military. So think of that. A Spanish spy was the #1 person in the U.S. Army. And during that time, he would pass on secrets to the Spanish, including strategy, troop movements, and he even tipped them off to Lewis and Clark's expedition. So, and one of his chief cohorts was Aaron Burr in the Burr conspiracy, which was to make an independent nation out of middle America. So he was called Agent 13. He was a man who cheated his entire life. So he's a very interesting read in the book. I'll quickly mention another person before John talks, is Governor Joseph Desha. Joseph Desha was the 9th governor of Kentucky. And it's probably hard to rank any governor when there's 50-some governors. But if there's one who is possibly the worst governor we've ever had, it might be Joseph Desha. You know, he was elected governor in 1824, and his son, Isaac Desha, murdered a person by the name of Francis Baker, who had come to Kentucky. And it became obviously a high-profile case. And the murder took place the year Joseph was elected governor. And I don't have a picture of him to pull up. And it was a brutal murder. I mean, very, very brutal. Well, the trial started, and the governor, they moved the trial to the governor's home county. And the judge was a friend of the governor. George Pegleg Shannon was his name. And Isaac's attorney was a good friend of the governor and was a member of the state's highest court. Well, the jury found Desha guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. Well, Judge Shannon, of course, said the evidence was tainted and set aside the verdict. Well, this highly watched trial, that was a widespread public anger. So there was a new trial. And again, the son was found guilty of murder and had a date with the hangman. Well, the son, Isaac, tried to kill himself. And the governor then pardoned his son for murder. And the son survived, and he was free to go. And because his father, the governor of Kentucky, had pardoned him. And when the son then moved to Texas following the pardon, where he murdered another person. And so this was very controversial, and Desha had a very controversial term as governor. I'll point out one other one. I was wrong. I've got one other one I want to point out, and that's the shooting of William Toby. John's going to talk first. I got that backwards, I think. Right, John? Yeah.
Yeah, let me talk just real briefly about a couple of people and episodes that marked Kentucky in the second half of the 1800s, which in the big picture, that was a pretty dark period for Kentucky, of course, including the Civil War and some of the violence and divisiveness after the Civil War. But in the 1850s, we had who I would consider the first big financial crook in Kentucky, I guess, and his name was Thomas Page, and he spent about 20 years as Kentucky's state auditor. And by the time he left office in 1859, he had stolen quite a bit of money from Kentucky's state government. In those days, the auditor, in contrast to what the auditor does now, the auditor back then was really responsible for collecting all the revenue for government, from local governments and from tolls and taxes on banks and insurance companies. So he was responsible for a lot of money. After he left office, they were able to determine that he had stolen about $3.8 million in today's money. At the time, that was not, believe it or not, a criminal act. They could only try to claw back the money from people who had put up bonds for Page and others. And anyway, we treat each of these people a lot more in detail in the book, but unfortunately for Page, after he was caught, he died in poverty in Frankfurt, and there's a picture that Bob took of his grave at the Frankfurt Cemetery. The next person who I think played a kind of a corrupt role, I guess you'd say, although he would probably argue he was just following orders, was Union general named Stephen Burbridge during the Civil War. He initially distinguished himself as a soldier in several big battles early in the Civil War. And then Ulysses Grant named him to be the commander of Kentucky, which was sort of a hybrid military and civilian role. But in that role, he really incurred the wrath of, I think, a majority of Kentuckians that had some long-lasting effects. But he took over as commander of Kentucky in early 1864, and he barely lasted a year in that job because as he attempted to implement President Lincoln's orders, he really went overboard as far as I'm concerned. Lincoln had declared martial law in Kentucky because Kentucky was experiencing a lot of raids on innocent people and property by ex-Confederate soldiers and Southern sympathizers who were killing people they thought were Union sympathizers and stealing a lot of food and horses. So Lincoln declared martial law, and he actually went ahead, as most of you probably know, and suspended the writ of habeas corpus. So the military could arrest people who they suspected of being Southern sympathizers and jail them. Burbridge, I think, took it a step further, and he declared that for every innocent, unarmed Union sympathizer who was killed by these marauders, there would be 4 Confederate prisoners or Southern sympathizing prisoners who were in military jails around the state executed. So he carried out this bloody order for about 6 or 8 months. And the Union did execute people all over Kentucky, really. And in the end, there were an estimated 200 of these prisoners were executed, including several right over here in Midway, where I live, right in the middle of town is what they usually do. They bring them into town and basically make them dig their own graves and shoot them right there. So this really, as I said, diminished sympathy for the Union and drove people really toward the Southern cause. He was taken out of that position in February of 1865, just before the war ended. And it's argued that in the long term, a lot of people say Kentucky didn't join the Confederacy till after the Civil War was over, and Burbridge's actions may have been part of the reason that happened. And then after the Civil War, there was a period of darkness. There was a lot of violence in Kentucky. White Kentuckians did not accept the freedom of a lot of former slaves, and they certainly didn't accept the idea of those former slaves having the right to vote and hold jobs. And the legislature, sadly, was very sympathetic to the white suppression, and they passed laws that prohibited blacks from serving on juries, really made it difficult for them to vote. They couldn't testify in a court case against a white person. So this, I think, was kind of the foundation for a lot of the violence that beset the state for the next 1900s, 1800s. So, Bob, if you want to talk a little bit about the next chapter.
Okay. I wanted a person of interest, it relates to Congress. We've had congressmen from Kentucky that have been in duels, for example, which we highlighted in the book. But one I want to mention to you is the shooting of William Toby. Now, Toby served in the United States. He was a congressman from Kentucky, and he served for, for two terms. And there's another individual that we talk about in the book, Charles Kincaid, who was a Louisville Times reporter, correspondent. And he reported that Congressman Toby, was found in a compromising position with a young woman in the U.S. Patent Office. Well, this scandal marked the end of Toby's political career, but Toby was not happy, and they would, anytime they'd run into each other, it was not pretty. Well, over the next couple of years, they'd run into each other in the U.S. Capitol because Toby had become a lobbyist, and he would insult Kincaid whenever they crossed paths. James Clotter talks about that, as they passed each other, the former congressman would pull the reporter's nose and his ear, as an example. He'd actually touch him and do that. Well, on February 28th of 1890, Toby came across Kincaid at the Capitol and threatened the journalist. And according to the doorkeeper and witnesses, Congressman Toby grabbed Kincaid by the coat collar, and Kincaid said, "Look, I'm not in a position to fight you, and or to go out in the corridor with you." Well, they saw each other again. Now, Toby was much bigger than Kincaid, and a couple hours later, they ran into each other in the Capitol, and Kincaid drew a revolver and shot the former congressman right in the face, just a quarter inch from his left eye. And Kincaid, he admitted it. He just stayed right there. He admitted what he did. Now, they thought the congressman would live, but he didn't. And the shooting sort of perpetuated the image of Kentucky being a violent state. And the trial took place. A lot of people testified. 8 former colleagues of members of Congress, testified to what happened, and that Kincaid had shot him. But following the trial, Kincaid was then found. What do you think? He was found. He was acquitted because of the harassment that he received from Toby. And then following the trial, Kincaid came back to Kentucky, became a reporter in fact, including the Cincinnati Enquirer. One interesting thing is I've been to the spot in the Capitol where the shooting took place on the steps. And to this day, you can look down on the steps and see Toby stains. To this day in the U.S. Capitol, right on the steps. So, Another interesting case that I'll profile tonight is the Pollard Breckenridge affair. Now, the name Breckenridge is just, very well known in Kentucky politics. And one of the Breckenridge is William Campbell Preston Breckenridge, and he was a congressman. He married the granddaughter of Henry Clay, and she died in 1860, which will be relevant. He then married a person by the name of Isaiah Descha in 1861. And, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was a possible Speaker of the House. He very well might have been. Now, he was extremely prudish. His pronunciation on morality and women's behavior would prove hypocritical. He thought chastity was the foundation, the cornerstone of government and of society, and he was against women, holding hands, promiscuous kissing, touching, all of this kind of stuff. Well, there was a lady by the name of Mallard. This, by the way, is Breckenridge. I'm sorry I didn't put it up quicker. This is a picture of him. And then this next picture here is Madeline Pollard. Now, she brought suit against Breckenridge in 1893, claiming she had been his mistress since 1884, when she was 17 years old, and she was asking for $50,000 in damages. And the suit was for breach of promise because he said that he would marry her after his wife's death. And when Breckenridge married another person, she filed suit. During the affair, Pollard gave birth to 2 children and had a miscarriage, on another one. And this case captivated America because, as one author said, Pollard was determined to challenge the different standards that were there for men and women. It really clued people into the different standards that women were held to and men, and how they had different consequences for their personal and professional actions and lives. Well, the jury agreed with her and gave her $15,000. And William decided to run for re-election. And despite serious opposition, he had a good chance of winning. And he only lost by 255 votes. And thus his political career, was over. He's buried in Lexington Cemetery, and he died in 1904. She went on to Europe, married somebody, and had a great life. So that's that's Pollard. Nope. Well, this person is somebody that John's going to talk about right now.
Okay, yeah, I want to talk about the next 2 people, one of whom I guess you'd say was probably the perpetrator of one of the great corrupt episodes in Kentucky history, and the other was the victim of an equally, or if not more, corrupt episode. So the first one, the perpetrator, would be James W. Honest Dick Tate. And you really can't talk about political scandals in the United States without talking about Honest Dick Tate. And his name was not actually Honest Dick Tate or Honest Dick. Most of his life, he was called kindly old Uncle Dick or some other appellation. But he's another argument for term limits, probably. At the time, the state treasurer could serve a 2-year term, but could run for re-election as often as he liked. And Honest Dick Tate, ran 11 times for state treasurer, was elected 11 times to 11 consecutive 2-year terms. One of the reasons he was so popular, though, was because he was such a genial fellow and so kind to his colleagues at the state capitol and pretty much anybody else who needed some money, because he had a habit of loaning out money from the state treasury and giving salary advances to others who worked there at the Capitol, and including at least one governor and some other people who should have been exercising some oversight of his office. But over the period of 20 years, he engaged in a lot of what you'd call pretty slippery management of that office. For his own purposes, he gambled a lot of the money in speculative stocks and land deals, including Eastern Kentucky coal and bourbon. There was a real, even before today, there was in the 1880s, there was a bourbon craze around the country, really, and so he had a lot of money invested in bourbon. And at one point, he even started a newspaper in Cincinnati, and that went bankrupt pretty quickly and left him with a mountain of debt there too. But he was first elected in 1867, and by 1885, people had grown a little skeptical of Uncle Dick, and it was an off-year election when he wasn't running on a slate with anybody running for governor. And so he had some more vigorous opposition, and some of the state's newspapers began to question his long tenure in office and began to suggest that maybe somebody needed to examine good old Dick Tate's bookkeeping. So the pressure began to build on him. He was reelected anyway for the 10th time in 1885. But then in 1887, he's up for reelection one more time. And there was a lot of pressure on him this time, including from some reform-minded people in the state legislature who wanted to open up his books. And the United States generally was going through a period of civic reforms. There was a lot of anti-corporation feelings beginning to build, and so Dick Tate began to make excuses for why he couldn't open up his books. He had a sick family member he had to stay at home with, and he came up with a string of excuses to try to stay away from people who wanted to hold him to account. Finally, the legislature came into session in early 1888, and with them in town, they really began to pressure him. And he on a Wednesday in mid-March, he told the people in his office that he needed to go to Louisville to take care of some business. He would be back on Friday to meet with the state auditor about his books. And he was seen in the office that day with an extremely large roll of cash and several tobacco sacks filled with gold coins. And then he left, and basically he was never seen in Frankfort again. He went to Louisville, spent a couple of leisurely days there, told his wife he wouldn't be back on Friday night as he expected. And on Saturday, he got on a train to Cincinnati. One person knew him on the train, saw him get off the train, and that was the last time anybody ever really knew where Dick Tate was. And a legislative investigation later determined that his accounts were short by about $6.7 million in today's money. And so, as you can imagine, that was a hefty portion of the state treasury in those days. You know, it became almost an instant legend among the, that was also a time of yellow journalism and preceding the Spanish-American War. And he was seen all over the world, really, by people, supposedly China, Japan, South America, Honduras. He never did turn up, though, but his daughter was able to go to court and cash in a couple of insurance policies after she had him declared legally dead 10 years after he disappeared. So the other person I wanted to talk about, the victim of one of the great corrupt acts in Kentucky history, is Northern Kentucky's own Governor William Goebel, who had quite a backstory, starting with his parents moving from Pennsylvania. They were German immigrants, actually, who his father served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And when he returned from service, he moved his family to Covington. And they were anti-slavery. They were pro-civil rights. And Goebel grew up in the German immigrant community in Covington, which was probably unlike most of the rest of Kentucky in terms of its Southern sympathies and post-Civil War sympathies. He became an excellent lawyer, joined a law firm in Covington. A lot of his cases were against the railroad companies, who he accused of mistreating their employees in a variety of ways. And he became quite adept at taking on the railroads. Based on his reputation that was, growing, he was elected to the state Senate to represent Kenton County when he was just 31 years old. In the legislature, he fought for public education, fought for civil rights for blacks, and fought to lower the tolls on a lot of the toll roads and bridges in Kentucky, including the Roebling Bridge, which was the main connection between Covington and Cincinnati, which a lot of his constituents used to go to work every day. So he incurred the wrath of quite a few people, though, and actually shot a man on the streets of Covington at one point. They had a long-running disagreement, and they drew on each other, and Goebel fired the fatal shot, but it was later cleared of any wrongdoing. In the governor's race in 1899, Goebel was the Democratic candidate. Kentucky had a string of Democratic governors until 1895, when they had a Republican governor who was in office. Goebel's opponent in the race was the Republican Attorney General, and it was a hard-fought race. The Republican appeared to have won the race by a handful of votes. There were a lot of allegations of fraud. Goebel seemed to accept the result, but then some of his political allies convinced him to go to the democratically controlled legislature to contest the race. He did that. Of course, he was still serving as a state senator, and the legislature came into session in January, and the contest proceedings were ongoing. In late January, when Goebel was on his way into the Capitol, of course, he was shot, apparently from the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State was a Republican and was later tried and convicted as being part of the murder scheme. Several trials went on. There were mistrials, there were poisoned witnesses, and eventually, I think you could say Goebel died, of course, a couple of days, but in the meantime, he'd been declared governor by the legislature. And so when he died, his lieutenant governor took over. But it was never really clear, I don't think, that exactly what happened. Although some people were convicted, they were later pardoned. And so it still remains a mystery, I think. I always heard in Frankfort that Governor Goebel was Northern Kentucky's only governor, but my research proved that not to be exactly true. So that's the quiz question.
I'll point out this last photo. If you look at that little plaque on the ground, that is in front of the old Kentucky Capitol, and that marks the spot where Goebel was shot. So if you're ever down there, they actually have the spot marked. So I'm going to transition to a chapter that we have called The Bosses. And Kentucky had a lot of well-oiled political machines. And these machines, as you may know, political bosses sort of were run by authoritative political figures who really managed with a heavy hand, and loyalty to the machine was paramount, similar to Boss Cox here in our local area in Cincinnati. And voter fraud were key elements, buying votes and all of that. And Kentucky had many rural political bosses, and they ruled with an iron hand. So we highlight two of the bosses. And one of them is the Whalen brothers out of Louisville. Now, Louisville was rampant for political control by the Whalen brothers, and it holds a real unique place in American history of scandals because the voting elections in the late 1800s and the early 1900s were wrought with fraud, and Whalen's controlled the political machine. Ironically, Louisville is the first city in the United States to use the secret ballot. And, before the secret ballot, ballots were printed by partisan newspapers and marked who, to vote on stuff. People would take them out of the newspaper and put them directly into the voting box. By 1892, the secret ballot was pretty prevalent, but paying for votes was not illegal until 1925. So anyway, the Whalens, I'll skip a little bit ahead, but their downfall in some ways was the 1905 election. It was one that was ripe in corruption. He orchestrated this fraudulent election, and he had done fraudulent elections for more than a decade. In the 190, well, in generally speaking, there was a lot of fraudulent names and on the ballots. And in 1905, this person, a guy named Paul Barth, was the candidate for the machine, and he was running against a fusionist candidate by the name of O'Neill. Well, voters were intimidated by police. Some violence took place, and people were persuaded not to register. African Americans were particularly disenfranchised in this election. They were threatened with violence and intimidated, and there was a lot of vote buying, and city employees were with all bosses. City employees were a big common support for their power, and in fact,
Sorry, I'm not sure about that.
And in fact, my Alexa just talked to me. I think it, but 20%, for example, 20% of the firefighters called in sick on election day. Election officers were supposed to be neutral, but 356 of the election officers worked for the city. They would put a train, if it was a precinct that there was one case where it was not going to be good for the machine. So they put a train there and put the polling station on the train. And when the line got long, they just simply moved the train to another location. They did this kind of stuff all the time. One ballot box was taken by armed men. Well, Barth won the election, as you would tell, but a court, the highest court in Kentucky, eventually declared that it was a fraudulent election and new people had to be sworn in. Barth actually committed suicide in 1907, in part because of the way he was treated afterwards. The next person, and I'm just sort of flying through him. This is a guy named Ben Johnson. Now, Ben Johnson was a congressman from Kentucky for 20 years until 1927. And he became the head of the Kentucky Highway Commission after he served as a congressman. They thought his political career was over, but it wasn't. And he had a very successful career. I mean, he wasn't 30 years old. He was the Speaker of the Kentucky House of Representatives. And he briefly tried to run for governor in 1911, but his Catholicism wouldn't allow that to happen in Kentucky. But he was a man who you either supported him and were loyal to him, or he hated you. And and you got to think, at the time he came into the Highway Commission, a few years earlier, the Highway Act of 1921 was adopted, and Kentucky was devoting 2/5 of its $28 million budget to the roads. And he put out, the roads were put out in places based on your loyalty to him. And if you weren't loyal to him, it was political reprisals, and if you were loyal to him, to all kinds of favors. Kentucky was called the detour state for a long time because there was a mishmash of roads. Nothing ever connected, and that was because the roads were put out for political loyalty reasons. He was a dictator of the Highway Commission, and the book goes into a lot of detail about him. But his big mistake probably was he was always interfering in gubernatorial politics. And, you do that, you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. So he was in and out of it. And eventually he lost his job where he wouldn't be back. But he's a fascinating story about the development of the road system in Kentucky and how it was dominated by political influence, in the early years. I'll turn it over to you, John.
Okay, Bob, and I know we're running a little short on time, so
Yes,
I'll
we
try
are,
to
yeah.
wrap up. We're trying to kind of touch on a lot of these different things, and I hope that if you get a chance to read the book, you'll get a lot more flavor of the background of some of these people and some of these episodes. Now, BOPTROT, and I hope what we've done here with our chapter on BOPTROT is really for the first time put the highlights and the lowlights of BOPTROT all together in one place. It was I'd say a widely varied scandal. It involved a lot of different people, a lot of different issues. I'll say in short, I mean, I was the legislature's legal counsel at the time. I don't know if that's a claim to fame or not. I didn't succeed in keeping those people out of trouble, definitely, but they were doing a lot of extracurricular things that I had no idea about, I'll tell you. But I'll tell you in short that for about 75 years after Kentucky's Constitution was adopted in 1891, about 80 years, Kentucky was dominated, state government was dominated by the governor. The legislature had a very minor role in governing the Commonwealth. They met for 60 days every other year. And the governor was, of course, there all the time. The governor had staff. So the governor made the budget and decided how the money for state government would be spent and where the roads would go. And he pretty much ran everything. And so lobbyists or special interests who wanted anything out of government would go to the first floor of the Capitol and see the governor. They didn't bother with the legislators who were hardly ever there. But starting in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, legislators began to assert themselves. That there began to be members who said, look, I'm running for this office, not just to pump up my law practice or my business. I want to do something when I come to Frankfort. And so they began to become more of a full-time and a co-equal branch of state government. Well, when that happened, the lobbyists had to come to them. They had to begin to develop relationships with legislators. And part of the way that lobbyists did that, the big money lobbyists, Tara, would do a lot of whining and dining of legislators. And sometimes they even took them on trips to places like Florida or Las Vegas. And they used that opportunity to develop relationships with these people so that later on, when there was a bill at issue, the lobbyists had a lot more entree to the legislators than the average person or their constituents did. So the BOPTROT really started with a fight between Riverside Downs in Henderson, Kentucky, a harness racing track, and Ellis Park, a thoroughbred track in the same town. And Ellis Park had a lot more influence with the legislature. So at that time, off-track betting or simulcasting was really getting started. And Ellis Park was able to influence the legislature to draft the law so that Ellis Park had a tremendous advantage over their crosstown rival, the harness track, when it came to showing horse races and even harness races from all over the country at Ellis Park, where they could take the bets on these horse races from New York or California. And Riverside Downs, which had just been bought a couple of years before by some Florida investors, was kind of left out in the cold because they couldn't really handle simulcasting like Ellis Park could. Well, the woman on the right there is Senator Helen Garrett from Paducah. And when she lost her primary election in 1990, she was looking for lobbying work around Frankfort to tide her over when she left the legislature at the end of 1990. And so in the fall of 1990, she told the owner of Riverside Downs that for $100,000, she could help him get the law changed so that his track would be more equitably treated as opposed to Ellis Park. And so she told him in no uncertain terms that she needed the money to spread around amongst other legislators. And by that time, he was concerned because he'd been mistreated so often by the state of Kentucky that he went to the FBI because he thought he was being set up. The FBI got involved in it. Helen Garrett, at the Riverside Downs owner's request, Helen Garrett sent him some money, committing a crime of mail fraud at that point. And the FBI began an undercover investigation that was going to last for several more years. And in the course of it, they were able to have their undercover people pass money around to legislators who were willing to accept it, ostensibly to influence legislation. It also branched out later into other issues unrelated to horse racing, like Humana had a big bill that they needed to get some deregulation of how they could open hospitals, and also the what they called the multi-county bank bill became an issue, and that branched out, and more convictions were gleaned from that. But what the FBI uncovered was a kind of a way of life among some legislators, not among a majority of them, obviously, but it had become a kind of a perk of office to accept things from lobbyists. And that when it was done in circumstances that it could be said it was in exchange for official actions, those legislators were guilty of corruption, accepting bribes, and 17 of them eventually were convicted, along with several lobbyists and Humana Corporation, and also the what they call dueling grounds racetrack at the time were convicted of handing out bribes. And so it was a major episode, obviously, and it's somewhat resembles when I read about what's going on over in Ohio right now. There's a large bribery scandal over there. That's for a lot more money. There apparently was $60 million involved in that. But, you know, legislators are usually part-time, and some of them, you know, can have their heads turned by the possibility of a big score. So the FBI was crucial in that investigation, and they have done a lot of great work on public corruption over the years. But it was much needed in Kentucky, unfortunately.
Hey, John, I think we're probably out of time for the rest of our session. We probably overshot our remarks because we have probably 5 or 6 more things to go through. So we probably overshot it, and Tara's probably grabbing hard to say, are they going to stop? So we were going to talk about sort of, John was going to talk about reform, and I was going to talk a little bit about how the traditions continued a little bit with some more recent scandals of the last 15 years or 20 years and such. But John, I think you probably agree, we probably ought to go to questions probably in our last couple of minutes. Is that okay? Yeah. So, and then okay. I'll put up a slide, Tara, that shows, I mean, you can, if anybody's interested in the book, yes, you can get it at Amazon, you can get it at any of the local bookstores, Walmart, different places like that. Or if you want, you can email me, and then we can send you a copy out of John and I's supply. The book's $22. We'll pay for the postage and everything. So you can email me and we'll sign it and stuff. So if anybody's interested in it that way.
Well, Bob, that sounds great. That was actually one of the first questions that I had. We've gotten a couple questions. How can we get a copy? I know for one, our book will apparently be here in a couple weeks, according to my husband. So we'll have to get you guys to sign it separately. I hadn't thought about that. So
Technically, it's not available till next week. John and I have our
That's what it
supply,
is.
but so if you
Okay.
order on Amazon, it's probably going to be a week or two to get it. Probably.
That must be what it is. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that presentation. I think everything you all had to talk about is just a testimony to what the book is going to be like, and so I'm really looking forward to reading it. We are a little bit low on time, just to respect everybody's time. I have just a couple of questions if people want to stick around, but let's get to the quiz answer first. So we can tell our winner that they have won. So besides Governor Goebel, who was the other Kentucky governor from Northern Kentucky?
Did anybody get it? Or you want me to give the answer?
I don't know the answer. So you have
the answer is Governor John W. Stevenson.
Okay, we do have a correct answer from someone watching on somebody watching on Facebook. Will Turwart, congratulations. We will be sending you a Northern Kentucky History Hour pin. So,
I wonder if he was the same person who asked if he could drink bourbon while the show was on.
That was someone else. That was one of our more loyal followers. Of course, you can drink bourbon anytime during the Northern Kentucky History Hour. I thought at first that they were making fun of me because I might have a glass of wine. It's been a long day.
Well, it's not fair that Will won because Will knows everything about Northern Kentucky history.
That's true. That's true. We have a group of very dedicated history buffs here as part of our audience. So just again, we're kind of out of time, but I did have one question, and it's actually just something that was asked, but I'm interested too. So Wilkinson, fascinating character. You mentioned, Bob, very briefly, there was some tie to him and Lewis and Clark. I had heard that there was something about Lewis and Clark when they came through Big Bone with Wilkinson. Do you know, is that in your book? Did you address that?
About the Big Bone thing?
Yeah.
About the Big Bone aspect? No, it's not.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have more information?
But I don't know a whole lot about the history of Big Bone and Lewis and Clark. Although
in relationship
many
to
of the things
Wilkinson.
that they took back from Big Bone, for example, was my understanding, if you go into Monticello, one of the first things you see is, a bone. And my understanding, that is from Big Bone, and it was given to Jefferson by Lewis and Clark. That's about the extent of my knowledge. What Wilkinson did was he tipped off the Spanish about the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. I, for some reason, thought I heard something else. We had heard another one of our loyal viewers had actually read another book, and unfortunately, I don't know the name of it, but that he had actually tried. Oh yes, Debbie Blake. Here we go. Wilkinson assisted Spain in attempting to kill Lewis and Clark when they were actually coming through Big Bone. Anyway, that was
wow. That's new. That's very interesting. I have to look that up. And
I'll get you the name of the book from Debbie. So
yes, I would love to read that.
Well, in addition to that, there were lots of questions about, Descha, for example, and someone mentioned that there's some streets in old downtown Frankfort named after Wilkinson and his conspiracy, which I thought was very odd. There's a lot of interesting comments in the questions. I would say 2 questions left for you two. John, are you going to be writing any more books? How did this project go for you?
Oh, I thought it was great, and I really appreciate Bob bringing me into it. This publisher is kind of interesting. They publish a lot of books of local interest like this, and Bob has done, I think, 1 or 2 for them before. So yeah, I'd be interested if I can. I've had some people tell me that there might even be a volume 2 of Kentucky political scandals, ones that we didn't fit into this book. So
that sounds right. Well, Bob, what about you? What's your next project?
I don't have one. I've been averaging about a book every 2.5 years. And, sometimes it just hits me, so, and sometimes people will call up and give me an idea. As I sit here right now, I don't have any particular ideas. I mean, you come up with the idea and you spend so much time researching and writing it. The last thing you want to do after you write a book is write another one, you know. But then somehow with me, 5 months down the road, I'm like, oh, I had to write another book, you know, because I really do enjoy trying to document local history and such.
Absolutely. Well, it's a huge benefit to our community, that's for sure. This has been absolutely wonderful. Unfortunately, we do have to say goodbye. I can't wait to read this book, and I'm sure the rest of our audience feels the same. I will just say briefly that next week we are going to be learning about a Kentucky government history 101. So a little bit different than this political scandals book, but definitely looking at Kentucky's history from our place in Virginia colonialism to how Boone County and some of the other counties were formed with Judge Anthony Froelich. So please come back and join us for that. I think it's going to be really kind of fascinating to learn, especially in Northern Kentucky with our government structure being so fragmented. I think I personally am interested in kind of learning how that all occurred. So please join us for that. If you'd like to learn more about Behringer-Crawford Museum, certainly we'd love to have you as a member. Please go to bcmuseum.org. And until next week, I hope you all have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.